A few days ago, I was speaking with a woman about spiritual direction, and she said that what she would love to have would be a verse from Scripture that she could memorize and call upon when she was feeling anxious and needed just to release those anxious feelings. I mentioned that there is an ancient tradition of doing just that in both Jewish and Christian tradition, and that the Psalms are quite often excellent for providing such lines we typically call mantras. The way it typically works is to breathe in as you mentally repeat the first half of the line or the verse, and to breathe out as you mentally repeat the last line or the last half of the verse. And actually, that practice works very well with the first line or the first verse of this morning's psalm. It would go like this. If we just did the first line, it would go that when we breathe in, we would think, give thanks to the Lord. And when we breathe out, we would think, for he is good. Try that with me, just a moment. Breathe in as I say, give thanks to the Lord, and breathe out, for he is good. Or if you wanted a longer line, you could take the whole verse so that you would say, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His mercy endures forever. So we would breathe in, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. And we would breathe out, his mercy endures forever. And of course, when you do this as a way of releasing, you can either just do it once like that, or you might do it several times, depending on what you need and how much time you had where you were. It's a great thing to do when you're stuck in traffic waiting for the train to go by on Court Street. In Jesus' time, Hebrew males were expected to memorize the Psalms. And often an opening line or an opening verse, such as the one I just taught you, most of the time, these opening words were used to mentally recall the entire psalm. It wasn't just about those words. If you spoke those words that we just did, it would call to mind everything in that whole psalm, not just the words we had spoken. Some people think that this was what Jesus was doing when on the cross he said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" which is the first line of Psalm 22. And that psalm goes on to cry from the heart about feeling abandoned by God, making a plea for God's help, and making an affirmation of trust that no matter what happens, God will take care of it and will take care of you in it. That was what that whole Psalm 22 did. So to call that first line called that entire thought to mind. And so the Psalms are good for that. And I think since I have called attention to this opening line of this psalm that we had this morning, I'd like to have you look with me a bit closer at what this psalm calls for. If you want to take out your little sheets that look like this so you can look at the psalm with me just a moment. The first two verses that we have here and the last two verses actually are something of bookends for the psalm. The first bookend, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good and his mercy endures forever. Let all those whom the Lord has redeemed proclaim that he redeemed them from the hand of the foe. That's one bookend. The other bookend, let them give thanks to the Lord for his mercy and the wonders he does for his children. Let them offer a sacrifice of thanksgiving and tell of his acts with shouts of joy. And so between those two bookends, the verses that are there, we don't have all the verses here. We didn't say all the verses. We just said enough to give us a flavor of it this morning. But the verses in between tell of those needs. The psalm invites us to give thanks to the Lord and to tell about the goodness that we have experienced in our own lives from the Lord. And so in this psalm, the verses between those bookends recount the good things that God has done for the whole people of Israel. They remember that the Lord has gathered them. They remember that the Lord has delivered them. They remember that the Lord has healed them. They remember that the Lord has saved them from times of death. But even as this particular psalm tells and retells the deeds that God has done for a whole people, some of the psalms are more personal. In some of the psalms, it's the particular person writing that psalm that's remembering how the Lord has been good in his or her life and is giving thanks for that goodness. And I think in our own culture, it tends to be this personal goodness that speaks more loudly to us sometimes than the goodness for us as a community. Thanksgiving and goodness. Goodness and thanksgiving. I think recognizing the goodness is usually what comes first. And that from recognizing the goodness, thanksgiving naturally flows. Given that, the big question for each of us becomes, in a single day, do we recognize the goodness that we experience? Or are we so caught up in trying to solve the problems of the day that we don't even notice the goodness? There's a tendency, I think, in this fast-paced world in which we live, to approach life as if it were a problem to be solved, rather than a goodness to be recognized and enjoyed. Think about that a minute. The difference between approaching life and everything you do in the course of the day as if it were just a problem to be solved, another problem to be solved, so I can go on to the next problem to be solved. Or approaching those moments of each day looking for a hidden goodness so that you could recognize and enjoy it. I was thinking about this, and the first thing that came to mind to me was a list. And I thought about the lists that I make, because I am big on making lists. I have lists about everything that you could possibly imagine. I have lists all over my appointment book about the things I need to do each day during the week. I have lists of items I need to buy at the store. I have lists of people who've called me or emailed me for whom I need to return the call or emails. I have notebooks after notebooks of lists of ideas that come to me throughout the day for sermons I'd like to preach, ideas for classes I'd like to teach, ideas for books I'd like to either read or maybe even write. But only occasionally have I made a list of the goodness I've experienced during the course of a day. And usually these lists, these goodness lists, usually they only come about when I've been directed to do so at a retreat, or in times when I've been working with a spiritual director or a mentor and they have suggested this as a way of journaling. But even though these lists of goodness may be few and far between, they are powerful lists. So I thought I might look back last night in some old journals and notebooks that I have. I have stacks of them all over the place. And in them usually there are things scattered in between things like lists of goodness, my grocery lists, and other things too. When I die, my kids are going to have a wonderful time reading through all these notebooks and seeing the list of groceries right next to something that's really important and serious. But I look back, I thought I'd look and see over the years, what are some of the things that I have written down when I have taken the time to write down a goodness list. And here are a few of them. They include a list that had something about a coworker and her husband in a secular job, a couple with whom I'd never socialized before, who invited me over to their house for dinner after the person closest to me in my life had died. We had maybe seen each other in the hall for 5 years and just said hello, worked together on some projects. But they invited me to their home, and obviously that was such a touch of goodness for me that when I made a list for that day, I wrote it down. Another one was my cat snuggling up to me in bed one night when I was upset about something. Another one was one of my children calling for no special reason at all, just to say hello and see how my day had gone. Another one was remembering an old crusty acolyte master who had been absolutely certain that only boys and men should be acolytes, who taught me in my early 30s how to acolyte. Another one was a seminary professor of preaching, who took me under her wing. Another was a very dear old friend with whom I had lost contact, and we found each other on Facebook and have reestablished our friendship. Another was a very dear new friend who encourages me on days when I feel like I haven't even done one thing well. And another on that list was me realizing one day that it was time to take a break and leave work early and to enjoy at least part of the beautiful day that was there. These span years. Some of them happened last week, some of them happened so long ago that unless I looked at the date in my journal, I probably couldn't tell you when. But they were all on lists I had made when I tried to look back and think of the goodness that I had experienced that day. And maybe when you hear these, maybe some of you are thinking, well, that's really nice, Gayle, but it really doesn't have much to do with the goodness of the Lord, does it? Maybe you're seeing them as nothing more than the goodness of a coworker or the goodness of my cat or one of my children. But you see, this is how the Lord's goodness typically works in our lives. The Lord's goodness works through ways that ordinary folks like you and me are moved by God knows what to speak or act to each other and to ourselves with compassion. Because all acts of goodness ultimately come from one source, the source of all goodness, the Lord who made the heavens and the earth and breathed a spirit of compassion into the breadth and into the depth of the whole universe. The ways in which we speak and act with this same spirit of action come from that God and will breathe within and through each one of us if we only allow the spirit of compassion to breathe, if we only allow the spirit of compassion to speak, if we only allow the spirit of compassion to act for others and for ourselves. Goodness and thanksgiving. Thanksgiving and goodness. With every breath in, may you remember these words, give thanks to the Lord. And with every breath out, may you remember, for he is good.